I'm delighted to introduce the panel tonight to discuss these issues and why storytelling is so important. Each of them is an expert in their own right and have decades of experience, not to make them feel too old, I apologise for that comment, across multiple media channels, and to highlight how things have changed and potentially point to future changes and their views on that.
It wasn't until I made that transition from being a page one writer, which is something you aspire to, right? Page one is the most ambitious journalism. I realized that there's a difference between aspiring to page one and actually aspiring to be read, or to the earlier points, to be engaged with, to be liked, to be shared.
When we talk about how the changes in technology has led to mass distribution, mass audiences, I think it's also actually led to some really great niche content too. That you can reach people. You're not going to reach 100 million people, but you can reach a loyal, dedicated audience.
There's a lot more competition, there's a lot more segmentation, there's a lot more choice actually. And I think choices are great. Look, if you're in the UK, and Madhurika can talk much more than I can, you grew up with like left, right, center, center, left, center, all sorts of papers that were clearly identified with a certain point of view. The difference, I think, from then to now is that people probably read 4 or 5 of those to get like a spectrum of views.
Right.
Now they're choosing not to.
Visuals have largely been considered supplemental to our stories. On the internet, visuals are fundamental to the story. So I think you're starting to see a power dynamic of visual journalists. Video for sure. You're seeing a lot of websites talking about the pivot to video. It's almost become kind of a buzzword and mocked sometimes. What the platforms did was create something where you're telling stories in a much kind of shorter bursts of information. And Snapchat, I think, was really at the forefront of this. And so that type of form now comes to a CNN. And so when I'm trying to give you the story of Harvey or Irma, it's not really just the inverted pyramid format, and I've actually been inspired by something that the platforms are doing to change the way that news consumption is happening on my platform.
This idea of multimedia really has happened, right? Because either you used to be a text journalist or an audio or a voice journalist or a television journalist, and we could run a picture with our stories, or you could run some captions and all of that. But now, especially young audiences expect journalism to be completely multi-platform, multimedia. So how you do journalism and how you deliver it and how you drive engagement has changed pretty much all over the place.
I think that all these new platforms and way of communication allows us to tell stories differently and reach audiences that we might not have otherwise. And allows us to tell things in real time that then you can reorganize and reshape. You just have to tell the story that's appropriate for that platform. You do something in Twitter that is different for what you do for Instagram, which is different than what you do for Snapchat. And I think you just need to be appropriate to those platforms, and that's how you build your audience.
My view of the media industry is that it's going to become 4 or 5 big buckets. There's going to be the few single brands, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, which will remain small, continue to shrink, but may still be around for a long time. Then there are the traditional Facebook and Google, the big kind of tech platforms. The third one is going to be the telecoms all becoming platforms. I think that's a battle we are going to see in the next few years. And then there'll be 2 other kinds of media companies. One is the typical, the house of brands. By that I mean Time Inc., Condé Nast and Hearst, where they have a bunch of brands that happen to be in the same company, don't necessarily have anything to do with each other. For example, Fortune and People magazine don't have anything to do with it. They happen to be Time Inc. Right? And then finally, a group of companies will emerge or start to emerge, which are what I would call as a branded house, where there's a lot of simpatico between the brands. People move seamlessly between like one brand and the other, and they all happen to be part of the same. And you create a little bit of a network effect to deal with some of the bigger networks. The thing we have to, I think, all live with is that the entire ecosystem is going to be not stable. That's it. That's the reality of it.
I think brand still matters. Part of it is, adapting the brand that you already have for a different growing audience. And for some newer brands, it's trying to get that brand equity. I think particularly in a sea of just overwhelming content, people need some guidance and something in them that'll tell them, I'm going to this one, not that one. So I wouldn't underestimate brand. The other thing I'd say about platform distributions, I mean, both Raju and Mitra have talked about, they are not as dependent on some of these platforms as a lot of newer companies are. And I think that that's another mistake that people have made, to go with, oh, we've got to be everything on Facebook and tailor it to Facebook, to a company that has gives us no insight into anything. If you're getting your 88% of your traffic from Facebook, you're doing something wrong.
The president has set himself up in some ways as the adversary of the media, and it would be easy for the media to play the adversary back, right? To kind of fight that and be like, we're not fake news, you're fake news, or however you're going to insult each other, and it could kind of go down that road. For our newsroom, it's really, really important that our journalists feel like they are committed to chronicling stories of the societies, beats, countries that they are in, that their commitment is to actually the journalism, it's to the story, versus setting themselves up in some combative role. And that might sound lofty, but I actually think it's really important as you're facing these assaults day in, day out, to get back to your mission of why are we here, why are we doing this, what's the story we're trying to tell, who is it for, how do we reach them?
I mean, to me, the bigger issue with fake news, in addition to the problem of actual fake news, is kind of the labeling of it, right? So when we have a president in our country who goes about labeling entire brands as fake news or failing news or whatever, what he's doing is undermining long-term, not only the brand, but the health of the industry. Because as you heard us all talk about, the brand is the most important thing, and that's how we're going to succeed. But here we have a president who's able to convince 40% of the country that an entire brand is fake, right? Whether it's CNN or the New York Times or the Washington Post, which means that a huge potential audience is basically saying, I don't believe anything you say. So to me, that has a much more profound impact on the future of our industry than worrying about how do we combat a piece of news that is fake or not, because there are lots of ways to do that.
Stories, because I think what has been interesting is the self-policing amongst the audience and people calling out things that they see. There's a lot of corrective mechanisms. One of my most favorite one of the last few weeks, you've probably all seen some version of the shark in the floodwaters. The shark is really, really smart and really energetic because it went from the floodwaters in Harvey to the floodwaters in Irma, and it's apparently been in floodwaters for the last 5 years. People, if anyone posts that, then there's a torrent of, people telling you this is just bogus.
How do you go to a country, how do you go to Africa and kind of say, we have amazing journalism in the US when the president of your country is saying we have really bad journalism in this country? So he's profoundly changing the role of the US and its ability to kind of spread quality journalism around the world. So this long-term impact of what he's doing is the bigger issue for me.
I think one thing that the data has allowed us to do, I think making newsroom judgments, I don't think it should be data-driven, but it should be data-informed. And that is a huge, huge help. I mean, when I was at NPR, I always felt in my gut, I knew when stories were just too slow, weren't moving fast enough. Or, I would just say, look, that first 45 seconds really matters. And if the intro is 30 seconds and then you're talking for 45 seconds, we have lost everyone in a minute 15. And you kind of knew that, but NPR developed an app called NPR One, which they could do a lot of examination of what people were tuning into, when they were dropping off, how long they stayed. And what that allowed us to do was just for the newsroom to understand, no, you know what, your intro's got to change. You got to figure out how to grab people in that first 30 or 45 seconds. And if we didn't, if it was just newsroom leaders saying that this is what my gut tells me, I don't know that you could be as effective as if the data tells you that.
So for me, there's behaviors like, did you read something on Instagram and you're coming to check it out? Did you follow a link? And there's a lot of technology behind this, but I think the more we know about what users are coming for, the better we can serve them. And this gets to the earlier point about form. It might not be an article that they want to read, 700 words to kind of figure out this one factoid, or, and that's the part that technology can help us, but it's also kind of like a puzzle.
I actually would be terrified of trying to go back and be a journalist now, because the young people today have so many better skills of telling more engaging stories than I ever did, that I actually think journalism is in really, really good shape. It's the business models and how do we sustain it. There are lots of challenges, but the act of storytelling, I think, has never been better in my lifetime.